Let's talk about how to join two blocks together with my brand new special sashing technique. I highly recommend that you practice this on some scraps so that you get the right numbers and the right seam allowances and all of that kind of stuff before you try doing it on your main quilt. So I have some pieces that are 3 inches wide, 6 inches tall. There's a front and a back and a piece of batting. So I highly recommend that you use the same fabrics that you used in your quilt, especially the same kind of batting. So 2 pieces, 3 inches by 6 inches. By having them a very specific size, that allows us to measure them and all of that good stuff once we're done, so that we can see where we might need to make adjustments. In addition to these 2 pieces, and these represent blocks, and I've written on here, this is the top and it's the right side versus the pink, which is the wrong side. So both of them, this is what I'm calling the top. Both of them, this is what I'm calling the right side versus the wrong side. We've also got a piece of sashing fabric. This is 2 1/8 of an inch wide, which is what it will be when you are joining actual blocks together. Now, this particular fabric has a right side and a very similar wrong side. You will be able to see the wrong side of the fabric on the back of the quilt. Now then, my thinking is we are using Moda Grunge for Mel's Practical Joy, and that has the beautiful fact that it has a solid color on the back. So you could, if you wanted to, turn a piece of Moda Grunge over and you've got a beautiful solid on the back. This actually, you know, it actually looks really good on the back as well as on the front. Okay, let's see what we're going to do. You're going to position your blocks so that you've got 1 block on the right, 1 block on the left. It might be that you have the tops up here. It might be that in the actual quilt they're oriented like this, and so this is more like the top. Either way, we're going to work, instead of having a horizontal joint, we're going to always work with it as a vertical joint. That is going to make life so much easier. So the block that goes on the right hand side or the bottom, the block that goes on the left hand side or the top. We're going to take the sashing fabric, we're going to place it right side down on this guy over here, and I highly recommend that you actually pin the sashing in place on the beginning of the seam and on the end of the seam, and depending on how large your block is, at various places along the seam. You want to make sure that you're not kind of extending this out beyond the width of the block, because we want it to be an exact match when we join it on here. You might want to use a little bit of double-sided quilter's tape under this seam to hold it in place. Make sure that you don't get any of that gathering. Another thing, if your machine has dual feed, make sure that you are using dual feed. If not, use a walking foot. You're working with 3 layers of a quilt and the piece of sashing, so a walking foot or dual feed is going to make life a lot easier, and the finished result is going to be so much better. So we're going to stitch that with a scant 8-inch seam. Now, on my 8 series Bonina machines, I usually use a number 34 foot, which is the clear foot with a solid red line down the center, and I move the needle over to the right hand side to achieve my 1/4 inch seam. Usually I have the needle 1 in from the right hand side. For my scant 1/4 inch seam, I move the needle fully over to the right hand side. whatever you need to do to get a scant 1/4 inch seam. And this is why I recommend that you practice. You might need to try this 2, maybe even 3 or 4 times in order to figure out what is your best seam allowance for this first step, so that you get the desired finished result. Okay, so you are going to stitch down there. I'm actually going to pretend for this one that I've stitched it and put a couple of pins in. So scant 1/4 inch seam, stitch down there. Then when you come back, you're going to open it up and you're going to flip it so that it goes right side down on the second block, the one on the left hand side. You're going to get that in position. You're going to pin it at the top and at the bottom, and as many times in the middle as you need to stop the sashing from shifting. And you are going to go and stitch that also with your scant 1/4 inch seam. Once you've done your stitching, this is what you're going to have. So remember, this is the top and this is the right side. This is the wrong side. The pink is the wrong side. So we've got a scant 1/4 inch seam, and we did this right side together with both of these guys. Now you are going to finger press the sashing away from your quilt block. Now you don't really want to do this with your iron. That is going to really smush your quilt. If you do want to do this with an iron rather than your finger, make sure that you have a dry iron. Steaming a quilt is never a good idea. Okay, so finger press the sashing away from the block, and then doesn't matter which one you start with, you want to get a really nice tight fold around the edge of that block. So again, practice 2, maybe 3 or 4 times so that you get a feel for how tight you need that to be, and then you can pin it. For these little samples, I haven't been pinning it, but when you're working with an actual block, you definitely want to be pinning it to make sure that you are nice and tight all the way along. And you're going to go and stitch in the ditch right along that seam there. Once you've done the one, then you're going to do the other as well. So remember, you're really pulling this tight around the edge of the block and creating a fold. You're going to pin it. Make sure that you've got it nice and tight around the edge of the block all the way along. Let's pop another pin in here. Now, when you come to stitch in the ditch down here, remember you've already got this and it may get a little bit in the way. So if you're not able to use your regular foot that you would use for stitching in the ditch down that line there, you could try your piecing foot, your 1/4 inch piecing foot, or you could try a zipper foot. Any way that you can to get that stitched down there. Once you've done that stitching, this is what you will wind up with. You've got the 2 pieces that are kind of bound around the side, and yet you have a piece of fabric that is joining them. So what you want to do is sit them next to each other, and it might take a little bit of a tug so that this lies nice and flat. On the back side, this is what you're going to have. A nice 1/2 inch sashing that is actually the wrong side of your sashing fabric, whereas on the front you've got these the right side of the sashing fabric, and you've got the join down the center. Next up, having gotten that nice and flat, and a little bit of finger pressing will work just fine, you're going to use a decorative stitch down the center, and you want to make sure that the decorative stitch swings from side to side. Now you might do a simple zigzag stitch, so you're going to be one side, the other side. It doesn't have to be particularly wide. So you could do just a little tiny zigzag stitch down the center as long as it's catching on both sides. One of the stitches that I'm really liking is the double-sided blanket stitch. So it does a stitch into the center, it goes out to the left, back to center, right back to center, takes a stitch forward. Again, you can see it doesn't have to be particularly wide. It does need to go from side to side. Play with the stitches that are on your machine and find a stitch that you like the best. Once you have done your stitching here, you're going to measure your block and refer to the assembly instructions for how big each joined block should be, so that if you need to, you can trim a little teeny tiny bit off. For this sample, when we started with a 3x6 and a 3x6, by the time you've got your join here, you should measure 6 inches across from here to here. So you do want to check that. If you're measuring more than 6 inches, then you want to go a little bit smaller on your seam allowance, and or you want to make sure that you're really tucking the fold when you're folding around the edge of here, you're really pulling that nice and tight. If you decide that you would like this on the back and this on the front, then you're simply going to start with the wrong side facing up, and you're going to put, let me see, wrong side of the sashing onto the wrong side of this. So when we started out here, let me actually go back to the beginning. When we started out here, we had the right side of the sashing onto the right side of the quilt block, and that gives us this pretty join on the front. If you prefer to have this on your front, but with the right side of the sashing showing, then you're going to start out wrong side, and you're going to put wrong side of this together. That will give you a different result. So play with some samples first. Make sure that you have your seam allowance at the right size, and that you've figured out how tight you need to be when you're folding around here, so that by the time you've got these two pieces, 3 inches, 3 inches, measuring 6 inches across there.